On October 3rd, 1887, when the dawn temperature in Endurance, Wyoming Territory, stood at 12 degrees above zero and the wind came down the rail, cut like a saw, Earl Lawson was already at her chopping block with a wool scarf tied over her mouth, splitting lodgepole pine by lantern light and stacking each stick to a measured curve instead of a line. Endurance held 312 souls that autumn, most of them in plank houses thrown up within the last 9 years along a single wind-scoured spur where freight cars came twice each week if weather and track both held. The settlement looked substantial from a distance, with a church steeple, a feed store, 2 saloons, and Gideon Pike's new lumber frontage painted white. Yet every building faced the same open country and the same northwest blow. Earl's cabin stood beyond the last wagon yard, where the ground rose slightly and the grass had gone brittle. And around that sodden stone shelter she laid wood in a ring 28 feet across, as precise as if she were marking the foundation for a mill. She was 27 that year, narrow-shouldered, wind-burned, steady in the jaw, with the heavy hands of someone who had lifted wet timber for more seasons than her face suggested. At 11, she had lost her father near South Pass, when creek ice gave under a trapline crossing, and the current pinned him beneath a shelf before anyone could reach him with a pole. He had come west from Finnish winter country and had spoken little in town, but he taught without mystery and without waste. In the 6 winters before he died, he gave Earl practical laws she could verify by eye and by measure. 3 cords banked for every month that real cold could hold, every fuel stack lifted above expected snowline, every windward surface broken or rounded so the gale slid rather than struck. He had no patience for bravado and less for fashionable claims about improved times. He said land did not care what men called modern. By the 2nd week after her father's burial, she had begun writing his numbers inside a seed ledger with charcoal, then copied them each season in ink when she could afford it, comparing what failed and what endured. She learned to read drifts by fence post height, to test greenwood by weight and tone, and to keep one reserve untouched until the hardest month arrived. She learned to cure pine one full summer longer than eager buyers preferred. She learned that cold punished delay first and pride second. In Endurance, where many had arrived by rail with cash, printed catalogs, and confidence in square framing, such habits looked to some like backward caution. To Earl, they were arithmetic. Gideon Pike, town builder and principal seller of milled boards, represented the opposite arithmetic in every visible way. He was a large man in his 30s, broad through chest and belly from prosperous years, with trimmed beard, lined gloves, polished boots from St. Louis stock, and a habit of speaking as if contracts could settle disputes with weather. He had built his influence one invoice at a time, financing porches and barns against spring cattle receipts, and by October 1887, he chaired council sessions whenever the elected headman traveled. Outside the feed store that first morning, with teamsters and ranch hands warming hands around coffee, he watched Earl carry split billets and called across the street, loud enough for all to hear. Lawson is building the Badger's Burrow. $14 in timber bent into a circle, because fright has taken hold of her reason. A proper stacked fence would do for half. There was laughter, some easy and some mean, and 2 boys crouched in imitation of Earl's measuring stance with elbows out like burrowing animals. Earl did not answer him. She crossed to the trader, sold 2 rabbit pelts for iron pegs at 9 cents apiece, purchased a coil of mason twine, and returned to her lot with the same pace she used when carrying water. An older drover asked if she meant to hide in that wood pen all winter. Earl set her pegs and said, "Words do not bank a foundation, and laughter does not warm a child." She offered nothing further, then pulled the twine taut and marked the circumference again, because half an inch wide at one stake multiplied into failure by the far side. By October 10th, She had cut and split 1 1/4 cord, and she began raising the first course on stone sleepers, scavenged from a discarded culvert, each sleeper 8 inches above grade, so meltwater ran beneath rather than into the stack. She laid bark side up on the outer face, heartwood inward, alternating butt and tip ends to lock each arc like interlaced fingers. Every 4 feet she drove one of her iron pegs and tied a transverse brace of willow rod, keeping the ring true against settling. The opening for each of 4 narrow crawl-through gates was measured at 22 inches, enough for a person with coat and bundle but too narrow for a full gust to punch through. She aligned each gate away from northwest exposure, using a cheap survey compass and a strip of cloth on a pole to verify wind line at dawn and dusk. Costs accumulated in small, painful units. Lodgepole from legal deadfall took labor more than cash, but mule hire for 2 heavy loads cost $1.40. Rawhide strips for later capping cost 60 cents, and nails or pegs always rose in price once frost threatened. Lamp oil went to 28 cents per quart by mid-month. Earl compensated by barter, smoking late-season trout, curing rabbit hide, and trading fence mending for flour. She kept records in the same ledger her father had once used for trap counts, noting not only expense but moisture content judged by split sheen and drying days under cover. Documentary precision did not make her admired. It made her difficult to dismiss only by those who looked closely, and few in endurance were inclined to look closely at anything a solitary woman built outside town custom. On October 14th, with a morning reading of 16 degrees and a hard rime on water buckets, she started the second tier and introduced a deliberate inward lean of 3 inches over the 7-foot height she intended, creating a shallow batter that shed pressure instead of receiving it broadside. Between ring and cabin wall, she left a service lane wide enough for one person carrying an armload, then scraped organic litter to bare soil so ember drift would find nothing to feed on. She planned a shallow trench there once the main stacks were stable, lined with scrap tin to catch sparks in the wind events. This was not improvisation. It was inheritance adjusted to local material. At the end of that week, when freight unloaded at the spur and men gathered to tally invoices, Pike repeated his nickname with greater flourish and told buyers that panic was bad for civic confidence. He pointed to Earl's curved wall and said he could build 2 handsome square yards for the same timber. Several nodded because square looked orderly and order looked safe. Earl continued laying wood as if she heard only the strike of her own maul. On October 19th, geese began crossing low and fast above Willow Creek, earlier than most elders remembered, and Earl paused long enough to watch their line angle south against a high, thin haze. She measured the noon pressure on a cracked brass barometer her father had traded for in 1879, saw the needle fall sharply, and tied another bundle of red cloth strips beside her door before heading towards town. The road into Endurance was already crusted with old frost where wagon ruts had hardened into ridges, and by the time Earl reached the hitch rail outside Pike's lumber frontage, the noon air had fallen to 14 degrees, though the calendar had not yet turned its final third of October. Smoke climbed low from stovepipes and flattened under a pale lid of cloud. Teamsters stood in a rough half-circle near the feed store door, stamping boots against packed earth and passing a tin cup of coffee while they argued freight timing from Cheyenne. Earl dismounted, tied Juniper short, and carried her cracked brass barometer under one arm as if it were a ledger she intended to collect. She asked for the council room and did not wait for anyone to escort her. Endurance held council in a back chamber off the Mercantile, 12 feet by 18, with 2 lamps hung from joists and a chalkboard listing rail arrivals that had become, over time, a substitute for caution. Gideon Pike stood near the stove in his dark wool coat, one hand on the mantel shelf, with 3 councilmen seated at a pine table and Reverend Hollis leaning beside the window. Earl set the barometer on the table, pointed to the week's readings she had marked in charcoal, and then listed what she had seen at Willow Creek that morning. Geese flying low and fast 2 weeks early, beaver lodges raised nearly a foot above last year's mudline, and wind veering north by dawn after 3 days of southerly drift. Her language remained plain and measured. She said deep winter would arrive before November, not with scattered flurries, but with sustained sub-zero nights, wind sufficient to scour exposed yards, and drifts high enough to swallow wagon tongues where no marker poles stood. Pike did not interrupt until she finished. Then he smiled toward the men at the table and asked whether Endurance now took weather law from trapper signs and creek rodents. He spoke in the voice he used for contracts, deliberate, public, meant to make agreement feel inevitable. Rail schedules, he said, had changed frontier arithmetic, and plank houses with proper stoves had ended the old panic habits of dugouts and stockpiles. He tapped the chalkboard with one knuckle and stated that communal coal could be purchased after first snow at a better freight arrangement, since current quotes from Cheyenne stood at $11.40 per ton and would fall once autumn grain moved east. Councilman Brewer asked whether any data supported immediate purchase beyond Earl's personal caution. Earl answered with numbers, not heat. 3 cords per hard month for each family without coal reserve. 32 households currently carrying less than 1 month of seasoned fuel by her estimate, and only 2 public buildings with foundations banked against underfloor draft. Pike laughed softly and called it borough arithmetic. The vote was taken in less than 5 minutes, 4-1 for delay, with Reverend Hollis abstaining, and then, after a pause, saying the town should avoid agitating fears before necessity. Earl lifted the barometer, wrapped it again in cloth, and said only that necessity rarely announced itself politely. At the doorway, Pike added, for every ear in the room, that any household running short could rely on his yard through the first storms, and that rumors of catastrophe harmed trade more surely than weather ever had. Earl stepped into the cold without replying, crossed to Juniper and rode back beyond the wagon yards while the church bell marked 2 in the afternoon. By the 3rd week of October, she had doubled her labor pace and cut sleep by an hour each night. The original ring was widened and then raised, course by course, to a full 7 feet measured from grade line at the highest point, with a deliberate inward batter that narrowed the crown by 6 inches and tied the stack against blowout when crosswind struck. She reset all 4 crawl-through gates, each 22 inches wide and 36 inches high, so their openings faced south and southeast, never northwest. She purchased additional rawhide strips from the butcher at 7 cents each, soaked them in warm brine, and stretched them over cap courses to hold top billets down when gusts tried to lift them like loose shingles. She tied the cap with mason twine in alternating diagonals, then sealed knot points with pine pitch warmed in a tin cup. Costs climbed and supply narrowed. Pike's clerk refused her lamp oil credit on October 24th, saying the proprietor no longer extended terms for panic works, and by month's end, 2 ranch foremen declined to hire her for fence repair after Pike told them that burrow habits spread fear among hands. Earl answered exclusion with barter and record keeping. She traded 12 pounds of smoked trout for 40 pounds of flour and 1 sack of coarse salt. She exchanged rabbit hides for used nails pulled from shipping crates. She repaired a widow's cistern hoop in return for 2 gallons of rendered tallow. Nothing was wasted. Every transaction went into the ledger with date, quantity, and weather note in the margin. 3 days passed before the next freight car arrived, and even then it carried mostly milled planks and stove fittings already purchased on account. Earl spent those days finishing the service lane between ring and cabin, then digging a shallow trench around the inner perimeter, 14 inches deep and a spade width across, lining its base with flattened scrap tin weighted by stones, so ember drift could not catch at root fiber or old grass. Where the prevailing wind curled around the ring's lee side, She built a vented cookpit of fieldstone and clay, 3 feet long and 18 inches deep, with a low throat to draw flames sideways rather than upward. She set 2 water barrels near that pit and shielded them with split slabs, calculating that reflected heat from the wood wall would keep a thawed skin over the water, even during hard nights. She cut marker stakes for future rope lines and painted their tops with iron oxide mixed into boiled linseed, bright enough to see through spindrift. Mockery matured into routine. Children in the street repeated Pike's phrase, calling her place the Badger's Burrow, as if the words were merely descriptive, while hired men bent at the waist and measured dust with exaggerated care when she passed. In front of the post shed, Pike told a cattle buyer that Earl's Circle would rot from trap damp before Christmas and then collapse inward like a failed kiln. The buyer laughed and said at least she would have kindling close at hand. Earl heard them while carrying a shoulder load and kept walking. Not all eyes followed the town's easy cruelty. Thomas Reed, 13 years old and thin as wire, appeared near dusk one evening with a tobacco tin held against his coat. He said little, only opened the lid to show bent nails, short lengths of wire, and 2 usable staples gathered from refuse behind the rail platform. Earl sorted the pieces by lantern light, thanked him, and asked what payment he expected. He shook his head and pointed toward the ring, saying he had watched gusts strike her curved stacks and slide past, while his family's straight pile toppled twice that week. Earl gave him a heel of rye bread and a pair of worn mitts anyway, then showed him how to seat a bent nail by pre-boring with an awl so dry wood would not split. Thomas returned twice more with scrap and left each time before full dark. On November 27th, after a string of hard mornings, Endurance woke to a false softness that unsettled the dogs. The noon temperature reached 38 degrees. The sky turned bright and mild, and men stood bareheaded outside the saloons, speaking of delayed winter as if delay were cancellation. Pike used the afternoon to stage certainty. He climbed the steps of his lumber porch, spread his hands toward Earl's property, visible beyond the yards, and declared that her ring would be a rotted monument before Christmas, and that sensible families should invest in proper square sheds while rates remain favorable. Several households signed purchase notes before sunset. Earl spent the same hours sealing her top courses with fresh rawhide and checking every gate lintel for looseness. When Thomas asked whether the warmth meant the danger had passed, she tied another strip of cloth to a marker stake and told him calm weather could be the smile before a knife. By dawn on November the 30th, the barometer had fallen again, faster than at any point that season, and frost formed in feathered lines on the inside of Earl's cabin window, despite the stove being lit. She saddled Juniper at first light, rode to the edge of town, and began driving shoulder-high stakes from the south lane to the nearest ring gate at intervals of 12 yards, choosing a line that avoided open cuts where drift could swallow a man standing. At each stake she tied a strip of red cloth, doubled and knotted so it would snap in wind but not tear free. She ran a rope through the first 6 points, tested tension, and coiled the remainder under oilskin beside the gate. Inside the ring she set 2 kettles over separate fires, one for broth and one for meltwater, laid out spare blankets and stacked dry billets in armload measures where they could be reached without exposing the reserve wall. She wrote notices on torn ledger sheets in a blunt carpenter's hand. Expected first night lows near 20 below. Likely second day wind equivalent near 40 below. Whiteout risk by evening. Rope path marked at south edge. She gave the pages to Thomas with instructions to pin one at the church door, one at the rail platform, and one at Pike's store. The boy carried them under his coat and ran. Near noon, the sky hardened to a flat iron white that erased distance. Thomas returned with a windburn on both cheeks and said Pike had torn the store notice in half on the porch and told gathered buyers that any soul abandoning a proper home for Earl's wood corral would lose spring building credit at his yard. That warning did what weather could not yet do. Families hesitated, then stayed put in brittle board houses with unbanked foundations and narrow fuel stacks already crusted in old snow. Earl listened, handed Thomas a cup of broth, and sent him back with one instruction only. When visibility failed, follow the red cloth and hold the rope with both hands. The first wall of snow struck before sunset. It came not as scattered flakes, but as a moving sheet that swallowed the church steeple in minutes and erased wagon tracks down to a white plain. Wind hit the ring and split around it with a low, continuous roar. Earl pulled the south gate shut behind her, checked the kettles, and stood one moment with her hand on the rope coil, understanding with full clarity that the night ahead would bring the same voices that had tried to starve her trade, and that she would open the gate all the same. She lifted the latch and opened the south gate 3 inches, then 6, then enough to drag the rope through without letting the full pressure of the gale seize it, and she braced her shoulder against the wood while spindrift poured into the passage like sifted flour. The ring did what she had built it to do. Wind struck the curved outer wall, split into 2 racing streams, and lost its straight force before it reached the cabin door. Inside that broken circle, flame in the cookpit bent low but held. The kettles steamed. The barrels showed only a skin of ice. Earl tied the main line to a buried anchor post she had sunk in October, a cottonwood length 3 feet deep with cross pegs driven through the base, then fed rope hand over hand through the first gate cleat and into the white dark beyond town edge. She worked by touch more than sight. Every knot had been set for mittened fingers, not bare ones. Every interval had been paced in advance. She tightened, tested, retied. When the line hummed rather than snapped, she shut the gate to a narrow span and listened. The storm answered with a long animal roar and no other sound. By full dark, she heard knocking against the outer stack, not knuckles but wood on wood, the butt of a rake handle striking in measured beats. 3 beats. Pause. 3 beats. Thomas had remembered the signal. She dropped to her knees, slid through the gate opening, and found him flat against the rope with one hand locked around it and the other dragging his younger sister Ruth, who had wrapped her face in a flour sack because her scarf had frozen stiff. Earl pulled Ruth through first, then Thomas, then latched the gate with a rawhide thong and guided them toward the leeward pit. Thomas shook so violently that he could not speak for several moments. When words came, they came in torn bursts. 2 houses on Cotton Lane had already lost stovepipe draft. Snow had packed under sills and into crawl spaces. The Boone place had no seasoned wood left. Reverend Hollis had sent 2 men to clear the church door, and they had vanished between drifts and could not find the bell rope again. Pike stood on his porch shouting that families should stay where they were and conserve kindling. No one could see 10 yards. The rail platform had disappeared to its roofline. Earl set tin cups in their hands and made them drink broth before she asked another question. Then she took Thomas to the line map she had scratched in charcoal on a board beside the stove, each stake marked by notch count, each branch route tied to one of the 4 gates. She changed her first plan in less than a minute. The southern approach would serve for intake. The east gate would become outbound for short-haul retrieval, because drift had likely buried the church corner and cut the old lane. She gave Thomas a fresh pair of mitts, wrapped Ruth in a blanket near the stove, and said, "You move only with a partner now. If you lose sight, you do not guess. You kneel, hold rope, and call." Wind drove harder before midnight, and endurance entered the part of a blizzard when habit began to fail. Men who trusted windows lost orientation when frost sealed the glass from inside. Women who had stretched flour by careful handfuls all autumn fed split kindling to stoves that could not hold draft against back pressure. Board walls trembled. Door seams whistled. At Pike's lumber yard, stacked planks tore loose from their bindings and skated across the yard like thrown cards. A team mule broke its hitch and vanished into the white, dragging trace chain that rang against buried stones. Earl and Thomas made their first outbound run at 11 by the church clock, though no one could see the clock face, and only the muffled bell told the hour. They clipped themselves to the line with loop knots at the waist, heads down, one hand on rope and one arm free for balance, and advanced 12 yards at a time from marker to marker by counting knots under mittened fingers. At stake 6, they found Jonas Miller, the blacksmith, on his knees with a shovel still tied to his wrist by cord so he would not lose it in drift. His beard had iced into a hard mask. He kept saying he could not locate his own door, though he had lived there 8 years. Earl clipped him to the return loop and walked him in. 3 trips followed in the next hour. Widow Pritchard and her son were brought from a half-buried lean-to after their stove fire died. A rail brakeman with a split boot was taken from beneath the freight platform steps. 2 sisters from the North Row arrived, carrying one feather mattress between them, because panic had convinced them they would need bedding more than water. Earl accepted the mattress, cut it open, and used the stuffing to wrap the feet of those already in shelter. She assigned every new arrival a task within minutes: feed fire, ladle broth, scrape ice from coat hems, rotate mitts near the stones. Idleness was cold. By the first hour after midnight on December 1st, 21 souls occupied the service lane and cellar under Earl's cabin, and the ring wall had begun to prove its second purpose. Heat from bodies and pit fire rose, struck the inward-leaning wood crown, and settled back down the inner face, creating a narrow band of livable air where outside temperature had fallen past 20 below. The trench lined with tin caught 2 ember showers when gusts twisted sparks from the pit. Neither shower reached fuel. The cap courses held despite repeated blows. At each impact, the wall shuddered and remained true. Across town, Gideon Pike's authority thinned faster than his supply. His store had offered security in October, credit in November, and commands at dusk. Yet by this hour the front awning had partially torn free and slammed against the porch posts with each gust, while snow pushed through side cracks into the grain bins. He ordered his clerk to secure lamp crates first, then changed the order to coal scuttles, then sent both men toward the church and called them back when visibility collapsed. He held his ledger under his coat as if numbers could still govern the night. Families on his block heard the shouting and no longer obeyed. The second outbound circuit began when Thomas returned with 2 older boys and a report from Cotton Lane. The Boone chimney had gone quiet. Marta Klein had attempted to reach her shed for coal and had not returned. Deputy Aaron Bell was trying to clear drifts around the jail flue with a pick, but wind had packed snow into the stovepipe opening faster than he could strike it free. Earl listened, nodded once, and reorganized the line teams into pairs with fixed routes. She sent Jonas Miller, now steady, to lead one pair to the jail because he could read roof pitch by touch. She took Thomas and one ranch hand toward Cotton Lane. They moved through a world reduced to rope, cloth tags, and breath. At each marker, the red strips she had tied 2 days earlier snapped like small pennants, visible only when lantern light found them at arm length. At stake 9, they reached the Boone door, wedged shut by drift to the lintel. The ranch hand used his shoulder and then a pry bar. Inside, the room was white at the corners where breath had frozen on boards. Mrs. Boone held her daughter Elsie wrapped in quilts near the stove, feeding green wood that hissed and smoked without catching. Earl pulled another blanket around the child, met the mother's eyes, and said the one sentence that mattered. They must move now. The return with the Boones took 20 minutes to cover a distance that normally took 3. Twice they lost footing when wind scoured the path down to hard ridges. Once Thomas disappeared to the shoulders in a drift pocket and had to be hauled by line. At the gate, Ruth and the 2 sisters pulled from inside, while Earl pushed from behind. When they reached the cellar steps, Mrs. Boone still held Elsie tight, and Earl cleared space by the stovestones and moved them down together. Work continued around them because stopping meant surrender. A kettle boiled over. Someone cried. Someone prayed aloud and was answered by the wind. Toward 3 in the morning, the storm deepened again instead of easing. The pressure that had fallen through the day now drove snow in horizontal sheets that found every unsealed seam in town. At the jail, drift load caved the stovepipe line where it rose past the roof edge, collapsing the flue and choking the draft. Jonas and the boys reached the wall by touch and found Aaron Bell down beside the broken pipe, scarf iced hard with ash and powder, already gone from the air he had tried to keep moving. Earl met them at Stake 4 with a sled improvised from a door and mule traces. They lashed him under blankets and hauled him in through the south gate as the wind hammered the ring. No one in Earl's shelter announced his death with ceremony. There was no room for ceremony. She covered Aaron Bell with a canvas grain sack, marked his name in the ledger margin, and moved to the gate because another knocking had begun against the outer wall. In the same hour, news came that Marta Klein had been found near her shed with a coal bucket still hooked over her arm. 2 men had reached her and turned back when they realized she was gone, choosing to carry her bucket because coal still burned. The bucket sat by the pit when they arrived, dented, half full, treated like a relic and a warning both. By dawn of the second day, December 2nd, Earl's ring held 34 souls, not counting herself, and her wood reserve had dropped by nearly 1 full cord. She shifted from rescue to ration method with the same calm she had used in October measuring pegs. Fire feed changed to half armloads every 20 minutes, never full stokes. Broth portions were reduced to 1 cup each cycle, thickened with barley to hold heat longer. Water thaw came from snow only after first meltwater was skimmed clear of ash. She posted Thomas at the line board and made him call intervals like a station master, because precision steadied fear. The mockery that had named her work the Badger's Burrow now returned in altered form, spoken low by souls seated shoulder to shoulder on cellar planks. They said the name without laughter. They said it while passing cups, while wringing gloves, while taking orders from the same woman many had refused to hire. Pike remained absent through that morning, trapped at his property line by a fallen awning and drifting loads, still trying to salvage what wind had already claimed. Those in Earl's shelter did not ask when he would come. They asked only when the next line team would go out and whether the rope still reached the church steps. Near noon, a brief lull came, not calm but a thinning of force, and Earl used the narrow Mercy to inspect the outer ring from inside the crawl lane. She checked brace ties at each quarter point, retamped 2 sleepers that had shifted under repeated impacts, and added cross-binding with the bent nails Thomas had once brought in a tobacco tin. Each small piece of scrap that had looked worthless in fair weather now carried structural weight. At the northwest arc, she found 1 cap strip torn loose and replaced it with harness leather cut from an old trace. The wall settled, creaked, and held. When she returned to the pit, Thomas stood waiting with the rope coil in both hands and a look that had no trace of boyhood left in it. He reported 2 shapes moving near Pike's porch and 1 lantern signal from the church side. Earl drank 1 swallow of broth, set the cup down, and nodded toward the gate. The storm had not finished with Endurance, and neither had she. Snow struck her face the instant she opened the gate, dry and hard as thrown sand, and Thomas dropped to one knee to keep the rope from whipping free, while Earl clipped her belt loop to the main line and angled toward the church branch. The lantern signal had flashed twice and gone dark. At stake 3, she found the first shape, not moving until her hand reached it. One of Reverend Hollis's sent men on all fours, with his coat frozen stiff at the hem, one arm hooked through the rope, and the other wrapped around a canvas satchel of church records he had refused to abandon. He could still speak, but only in single words. Earl cut the satchel loose, tied it to her own line, and set Thomas to lead the church volunteer inward. The second shape lay 30 feet farther on where the branch line bent toward Pike's block. It was not one person, but two under a fallen awning frame, half buried and pinned at the legs by a beam that had twisted when the porch braces failed. Gideon Pike lay on his side with both gloved hands over the head of his wife, Lenora, shielding her face from the drift. He had no hat left, no dignity left, and no command in his voice when he saw Earl kneel beside the beam. He said only, "Please." She cannot feel her feet. Earl answered with action. She drove a pry bar under the broken timber, braced it against a porch post stump, and told Thomas to pull when she counted. The first lift gained an inch. The second gained 3. On the third, Lenora Pike slid free into Thomas's arms, and Pike rolled after her, gasping as blood returned to his legs in violent pins and needles. The ledger that he had held through the night lay frozen open in the drift, pages turning in the wind like pale leaves. Earl snatched it, shoved it under her coat, clipped Pike to the trailing loop, and ordered him to crawl, not stand. By the time they reached the south gate, the temperature had fallen again. Earl checked her spirit thermometer nailed inside the ring post. 29 below. Wind still from the northwest, steady enough to keep the red cloth strips snapping horizontal. The storm had now held Endurance for 43 hours without true break, and square walls across town were failing in the predictable sequence she had described in October. First draft loss, then fuel waste, then structural surrender where drifting loaded one side beyond design. Pike's lumber yard looked as if a giant hand had raked it. Half his milled stacks were gone, carried into alleys or buried. The front windows of his store had blown inward under pressure when the awning tore loose, scattering lamp chimneys and nails across the floor, where no one could gather them. Inside Earl's ring, rolls tightened into discipline. Jonas Miller and 2 ranch hands worked the sawpit in shifts, reducing thawed billets to stove length without touching the outer reserve wall. Widow Pritchard ran cup counts at the kettle table, speaking each name and portion aloud so no one took twice in panic. Thomas, fingers wrapped in rabbit fur and splinted against swelling, called rope departures by quarter hour from the line board. Earl assigned Pike to splitting beside the leeward pit and set the axe in his hands without ceremony. He obeyed at once. Near mid-afternoon, a noise rose above the wind, a deep crack followed by a drawn-out groan that turned every head toward town. The church steeple, already masked by drift to the bell deck, had taken a gust on the west face and twisted at the base. It did not fall in one piece. It folded, struck the roof ridge, and disappeared in white. The church volunteer by the stove stones, wrapped in 2 blankets, closed his eyes and pressed his hand over his mouth, then whispered that Hollis had kept men on the doors as long as they could stand before sending them out by line. By dusk on December the 2nd, darkness arrived early behind the cloud lid, and the cold reached 33 below. Earl made the decision she had hoped not to make. No more far runs until first light unless a direct signal appeared at stakes 1 through 4. Beyond that range, a rescue pair risked becoming another burden, hauled home by others. She said this in front of all gathered souls, including those who had once mocked her ring, and no one challenged her arithmetic. They had watched too much weather in too little time. The signal came anyway, a frantic jerking on the church branch line that transmitted through the knots to stake two like a hand at the throat. Earl took Thomas despite his injured fingers because he read the markers better than any grown man in shelter. And she took Pike because he knew the porch layout where the pull originated. They moved in triangle formation, one at each rope segment, heads low against spindrift. At the corner where Cotton Lane met Pike's yard, they found Caleb Dunn, Pike's clerk, wedged between two freight crates that had shifted and trapped him against a post. He was conscious, but his right leg bent wrong beneath the knee, and each breath came with a wet rattle. From cold air he had inhaled while shouting for hours. Pike dropped beside him and tried to free the crates by hand. Earl stopped him, set the pry, and counted lifts. On the second lift, Caleb screamed once and then clamped his jaw shut. On the third, they freed him and lashed him to the drag sled. The return took longer than any run yet. Wind had built a new ridge across stakes 3 and 4, forcing them to dig and crawl over the crest while dragging the sled 1 foot at a time. Halfway in, Caleb stopped answering when spoken to. At the gate, Earl checked his throat with mittenless fingers and caught only the thinnest thread of pulse. Pike stared at the clerk's face as if waiting for a correction that did not come. Earl barked for hot stones, mustard, and dry wraps. Caleb Dunn went to the inner lane alive but fading, and Pike, shaking with exhaustion, helped carry him to a place near the covered corner where Aaron Bell and Marta Klein lay. No one slept that night. They rested in rotations with boots on, backs to warm stones, ears tuned to the wall. The ring absorbed impact after impact, timbers creaking but not giving way, and the trench caught 3 ember throws from a gust that drove pit flames sideways under the cap. Earl walked the inner lane each hour, lamp-hooded, checking brace knots and crown lean by touch. At one point, she found a gap opening where repeated vibration had loosened a willow tie. She stuffed the seam with snow, drove a wedge, and bound it with rawhide strip from an old harness. The wall settled. The gap closed. At first light on December 3rd, a grayness replaced black and gave shape to the nearest stakes. Storm hours now numbered 60. The thermometer held at 34 below, matching the worst reading her father had written after the South Pass winter of 1879. Earl reopened outbound runs in pairs and sent Jonas toward the north row with 2 ropes and a sled. He returned with 6 souls from a collapsed bunkhouse and 1 mule that had survived by standing over a drifted vent where warm air leaked from a buried root cellar. Every new arrival added breath, moisture, and strain to the enclosed space. Earl shifted half the group to the cellar and half to the ring lane, rotating every 40 minutes to prevent chill injury from stillness. Earlier that morning, the Boone family approached on their own, tied together by reins and led by Mrs. Boone through waist-high drift from what had been their doorway. They carried no bedding this time, no stove grates, no keepsakes. Only a sack of flour gone damp and a tin of lard wrapped in a shawl. Mr. Boone walked 2 paces behind, stumbling, lips blue, one hand fixed to the rope as if it were the last honest thing left in the world. He reached the gate, looked once at Earl, and tried to speak. No words came. He collapsed before crossing the threshold. Hot bricks, mustard rubbing at his chest, and slow spoon broth pulled a ragged breath from him at last, but he remained unconscious and cold stiff through the next rotations. The count of confirmed dead in endurance held to the name losses already carried through the storm. Marta Klein, Aaron Bell. Those 2 names traveled mouth to mouth in stripped phrases, each tied to an image no one would forget. A coal bucket, a broken flue. Around them, others hovered in uncertain ground. Caleb Dunn breathing shallow by the stovestones, Mr. Boone unresponsive under layered blankets, Elsie Boone still in critical distress from the earlier extraction. Near dawn's late edge, the wind changed pitch. It did not stop, but the predatory edge softened, and by 9 o'clock, drifting fell from a hard horizontal stream to a thick descending curtain. Earl waited another hour before calling it. 62 hours since first strike. The storm had broken enough for assessment. The first organized group to seek her after the break came from the rail cottages, 8 souls led by schoolteacher Miriam Vale, faces wrapped in blankets, 2 of them carrying a door as a makeshift litter for an elder whose feet had frozen to leather stiffness overnight. They reached the south gate and did not attempt pride. Miriam removed her gloves, set them on the snow, and said through cracked lips, "We have no dry fuel and no standing stove. We ask shelter and instruction, if you can still spare both." Earl opened the gate wider and stepped aside. "Leave wet bedding in the outer lane. Keep moving. Cups first, then task assignments." She pointed to the kettle table, then to the stacked billets by size, then to Thomas at the board. "No one sits idle. Heat belongs to work." More came in that hour. 2 miners from the east cut with a woman on a travois, a teamster and his mother carrying flour tins that had frozen solid. Finally, Gideon Pike returned from a short run to his ruined storefront with nothing in his hands except a single intact sack of beans and the brass till drawer, which he set on the ground near the pit as though surrendering office. Snow had caked his beard to white. His fine coat was cut at both elbows from crawling. He stood before Earl with shoulders bent and asked, in a voice the storm had stripped clean, "What do you require of me now?" She handed him another billet and nodded toward the block. "Split that to stove length, then split more. We will speak after all are fed." He took the axe and set to work, each stroke ringing inside the ring wall that had once been his favorite joke, while Earl moved down the line counting cups, checking fingers for frost whitening, and directing souls into a pattern of labor that held as steady as the curve of the wood around them. She did not permit gratitude to become idleness, and did not permit shame to become silence. Every soul who could stand received an assignment, even if the task was only stripping wet cloth from kindling or turning mittens at the stone edge, so one pair dried while another was worn. She measured fuel by armload and hour, not by pleading. She set Jonas at the saw, Miriam Vale at ration tally, Lenora Pike at linen rotation, and Thomas Reed at line checks where his sharp memory served better than his healing hands. When 2 ranch hands asked whether the outer wall could be broken for quicker access to reserves, she shook her head and made them crawl each gate in turn until they understood the principle in their own breath. A narrow opening saved heat that an open yard surrendered in minutes. By afternoon, the ring had become not merely shelter but school. Earl knelt in the packed snow with a coal nub and drew the windrows her father had taught her, marking northwest with a deep score and showing why straight stacks failed when gusts struck broadside. She sent men out 10 paces to feel the force beyond the curve, then called them back to stand in the lee where flame remained steady. She held up 1 seasoned billet and 1 green split from Pike's fallen yard, had each passed hand to hand, and asked which weighed more, which rang duller, which hissed at the pit mouth. Expensive wood had failed because it had been sold wet and trusted dry. Cheap deadfall had endured because it had been cured 2 summers and stacked with air between courses. No sermon in endurance had ever carried such authority, because no sermon had kept 39 freezing souls alive through 62 hours of white. On December 4th, after 1 full night of reduced wind, rescue parties moved past Stake 4 and into streets reappearing from the drifts like shipwrecked timbers from retreating tide. The temperature rose to 11 below by noon, bitter still but survivable for measured work, and Earl authorized longer runs with 2 sleds and fixed return times scratched on the board. Caleb Dunn did not survive the return from the freight crates. Despite splinting and chest wraps, his breathing failed on the rope line, and he was carried in at the gate under a tarp, stiff with blown ice. Mrs. Boone woke near dawn, confused and weak, and by evening she held a cup without help. Word came later from the cellar rotation that Elsie Boone had been lost during the night despite every warming turn attempted off the main lane. No one spoke over the report. Earl removed her cap, stood with bowed head, and then resumed the ration count because the living still required heat. The burials took place on December 5th along the ridge east of town where winds scraped snow from the ground, enough to cut. Marta Klein was laid down with the dented coal bucket beside the marker post because her husband said she had gone out to keep others warm. Aaron Bell was buried with the broken stovepipe collar set at his feet, not as blame but as witness to what poor venting and drift load could do in one terrible night. Elsie Boone's grave was set between them, her marker the smallest, her name carved by Thomas Reed with careful letters and one corrected stroke where grief had shaken his hand. Reverend Hollis read from Scripture in a hoarse voice, then closed the book and added words not written in any page. That certainty without preparation had become vanity, and vanity had asked others to pay the price. Snow moved over all 3 graves in fine lines, then cleared again under the ridge wind, as if the land itself insisted the names remain visible. 3 days later, when roads within town were passable to sled and the rail platform had been dug to half height, reckoning began without proclamation. It arrived first in labor. Men who had laughed in October came to Earl's lot with shovels and asked where to place new sleepers. Women who had crossed the street to avoid her in November brought rendered tallow, dried peas, and 2 coils of serviceable rope. No one offered speeches at first. They offered work and waited for instruction. Earl gave it plainly. Lift to 8 inches above grade. Bark side outward on weather face. Gate opening 22 inches, never more. Cap with rawhide or harness leather. Tie diagonally. Check after each hard gust. In that first week after the storm, Endurance raised 4 communal wood rings near the church ruins and 2 smaller household rings on Cotton Lane, each one traced from her twine measure. By the second week of December, children who had once jeered her crouched stance were copying it earnestly, pressing pegs with mittened thumbs, while Thomas corrected their spacing. Words followed labor as strength returned. Lenora Pike came one evening with a basket of mended gloves and stood by the gate until Earl looked up from splitting. She spoke in the formal cadence of someone determined not to hide behind tears. I heard my husband call your work a burrow for frightened minds. I repeated it at our own table. You cut me free from a beam and gave me fire with no condition. I cannot ask you to erase what I said. I can ask where I should begin repairing it. Earl handed her the next pair of gloves to sort and said, begin where the coal begins. Count fuel honestly. Teach your clerks wait and cure, not sales language. Lenora nodded once and returned the next morning with ledger paper and ink. Reverend Hollis brought the church satchel that had been carried through the storm and asked Earl to open it before witnesses. Inside, the records were damp but readable. She spread them near the stove, dried each page, and then placed beside them her own weather ledger, including the cracked barometer readings from October 19th and November 30th. Hollis copied the figures into the town register and wrote in the margin, in his own hand, that practical warning had been given and dismissed. The note remained. It was read aloud at council in March. Gideon Pike delayed his words longer than most because his pride had been the largest structure to fail, and large structures settle slowly after collapse. Through December, he split wood, hauled water, and reopened his store only for essentials at fixed prices, posted on the door. No credit threats, no winter penalties. He carried the brass till drawer to council on January 12th and emptied $36.80 into a coal fund established for widows and families whose sheds had failed. He set his storm-damaged ledger on the table beside it. The same book he had clutched as if it were law now contained frozen stains, torn pages, and names marked for spring leverage against those who sought Earl's shelter. He read each marked name aloud, struck every penalty line through with black ink, and said to the room, "I called her work the Badger's Burrow, and told this town fear was the only thing she was building. My square house failed first on the windward wall. Her circle held for all of us. Arrogance cost endurance 3 lives. That debt does not clear because I admit it. I am asking what service might begin to meet it." Earl answered in that same meeting, standing near the stove with split knuckles and ash in the seams of her hands. Her voice remained level, and because it remained level, every word carried farther than shouting would have carried. "Your words did harm. So did your policies. I was denied oil and work when preparation mattered most. I will not pretend that did not cut. But I did not build the ring for revenge, and I will not use this winter to collect humiliation as payment. My father taught that forgiveness without learning is only another form of waste. If you seek forgiveness, then learn the measurements, teach them correctly, and keep stores for those who cannot pay at first snow. Do that for years, not weeks. Call it what you wish. I call it duty." No applause followed. Endurance had learned enough about whether to distrust dramatic gestures. Instead, men and women lined up at the council table and entered their names for weekly instruction on fuel curing, wind mapping, cellar venting, and emergency rope lines. Pike signed first. Miriam Vale signed second and added the schoolhouse to the training list, so children would learn marker spacing before they learned cursive flourishes. Thomas Reed, still 13 and now carrying himself with the gravity of a much older hand, took charge of nail salvage and tie inspections for each new ring. His tobacco tin, once filled with cast-off metal, became the box where students dropped bent pegs for straightening and reuse. By April 1888, when thaw turned streets to axle-deep mud by noon and hard ruts by dawn, Endurance had rebuilt its church without a steeple and with a circular fuel yard on the lee side sized to Earl's 28-foot plan. By October, the town census counted 319 souls, and each household inventory submitted to council included seasoned fuel totals in chord fractions, stack height above expected snow line, and gate orientation. Freight coal still came from Cheyenne, yet no family depended on freight alone again. 2 neighboring camps, Ridge Arrest and Coldwater, sent delegations to observe Lawson stacking and returned home with copied diagrams on oilcloth. Years later, the phrase "the Badger's Burrow" survived, stripped of mockery and spoken with the plain respect usually reserved for bridges that hold under spring flood. Pike sold half his claim at a documented loss and spent the remainder of his working life financing communal yards on terms that favored widows first. Reverend Hollis kept the October barometer page framed in the council room as a warning against tidy certainty. The 3 graves on the ridge received stone markers in 1892, paid from a subscription that listed every household in Endurance, including Earl Lawson and Gideon Pike on adjacent lines. The rings still stand through hard winters across that country, weathered gray, rawhide long since replaced by wire and then by newer fasteners, but the geometry unchanged. In Endurance now, elders teaching autumn chores still tell children to measure the curve twice and trust the wind not to forgive pride. They call the method Lawson stacking. They call it practical mercy made visible in timber. And when the first geese fly low over Willow Creek, souls still look up, then down at their own stores, and begin. On that first low flight of geese after the hard winter, the whole town moved before sunrise. Not from panic now, but from discipline learned at cost. Earl stood at the communal ring beside the rebuilt church wall, with a measuring rod cut to 7 feet and a ledger board hung from a nail, while Thomas Reed, taller and broadening through the shoulders, called household names and stacked totals in a clear, carrying voice. Frost whitened every rail. Breath smoked in steady plumes. Each family stepped forward, declared chord fractions, and opened one tied bundle so moisture, bark lay, and cure could be checked by hand. No one called it meddling. They called it inventory. Gideon Pike arrived carrying 2 books against his chest, the new store ledger in clean calf binding, and the old storm ledger wrapped in canvas. He set both on the table without flourish and stood in line with everyone else. His wood count met the requirement. His coal count exceeded it. When Earl tested his top course and found 3 billets too green for reserve, he did not argue grade or price. He pulled the billets down, split them thinner, and moved them to the early burn stack while boys watched and learned that correction was not humiliation when winter was the examiner. By full morning, 7th October 1888, Endurance had recorded 332 souls and not one household below 2 full months of seasoned fuel. The council clerk posted the figures on the church door beside freight schedules, so no one could pretend one list mattered more than the other. Miriam Vale then rang the handbell, and classes moved outdoors for practical hour. Children measured gate widths at 22 inches, tied diagonal caps with scrap rawhide, and practiced blind rope travel in pairs with eyes covered by scarves. Ruth Reed, now with a slate under one arm and mittens too large for her wrists, corrected a banker's son on knot spacing, and did so with the authority of fact. At noon, Earl opened her own reserve shed, counted out flour, salt pork, and dried peas, and placed the sacks in a row near the stovehouse for the 3 households still rebuilding after stock loss. She did not announce charity. She wrote each allotment in the communal ledger and marked the column, winter loan in labor, then assigned repayment in spring ditch work and cord cutting at fair rates. Modest stores moved where they were needed. No one left empty-handed. The contrast with the prior year remained plain enough that no speech was required. The expensive square sheds had gone down first in the storm, and the cheapest carefully cured stacks had carried the living through. That evening, after kettles were scrubbed and the yard swept, the council met with all benches filled and standing room along both walls. Reverend Hollis placed 5 carved name boards on the front table instead of 3. Marta Klein, Aaron Bell, Elsie Boone, Caleb Dunn, Amos Boone. He explained in a rough but steady tone that Caleb had been buried after late thaw opened ground beyond the ridge crust, and that omission from the first winter service had been necessity, not neglect. Pike bowed his head at that line and kept it bowed for several breaths. No one looked away from the boards. Hollis then unwrapped the old storm ledger and laid it open to the page where penalty marks had once stood by families who might have sought Earl's shelter. The black strike-through lines remained visible, thick as wagon spokes. He read each former penalty aloud, and then read the matching council order that had canceled it. The room heard, in sequence, how policy had sharpened danger before weather finished the work. When he finished, he turned to Pike and nodded once. Pike rose slowly, hands on the table edge, coat sleeves rolled above wrists, scarred by months of splitting. "I used credit as a leash when warning should have been heeded," he said. "I sold green lumber as if it were ready, because sale books rewarded haste. I named her work The Badger's Burrow to make prudence look small. That name cost trust, and lost trust cost time in a storm where minutes were life. I cannot undo the dead. I can keep paying toward the living. He opened the clean ledger and read the current winter policy line by line. Fixed prices through freeze months, no penalties for emergency shelter movement, widow priority on coal allotment, and one communal reserve account funded before any spring expansion credit was issued. He signed the page in view of all and passed the pen to the clerk, who copied it into the town register. The reckoning did not end with him. Lenora Pike stood and stated that she had repeated mockery in private parlors and had taught younger wives to treat caution as embarrassment. She asked assignment rather than pardon, and Miriam Vale answered from across the room that school inventory books needed a second instructor for household arithmetic. Lenora accepted on the spot. Jonas Miller admitted he had laughed at curved stacks while his own toppled in first gusts, then volunteered his forge to make standard ring pegs at cost through winter. Two ranch foremen who had refused Earl work in October of the previous year gave their names and pledged teams for communal deadfall hauling every second Saturday. Each statement entered the minutes. The ledger became memory with teeth. Only after all others had spoken did the council ask Earl to stand. She remained by the stove at first, palms near heat, then stepped forward and rested one hand on her father's cracked barometer, which Hollis had brought from the frame for that meeting. The brass rim still held the hairline split from old trade years, and the needle still moved true. "I will not trade in public shame," she said. "Shame burns fast and leaves little heat. Learning burns slower. Learning keeps children alive." She looked down the table, not sparing Pike and not singling him out. "You ask what forgiveness requires. I answer again what I answered in January. Keep accurate stores. Teach measurements without vanity. Put reserve ahead of display when money is short. If you fail those duties, words spoken tonight will be ash by first blizzard. If you keep them, whether you call that forgiveness is yours to settle with God and with the graves on the ridge." The room stayed silent long enough for the stove iron to click twice as it cooled. Then Thomas rose from the side bench and held up the tobacco tin he had once carried with cast-off nails. He had cleaned it, hammered the lid flat, and painted the town name across it. "This is inspection tin now," he said, voice steady. "Bent pegs go in, straight pegs come out. Every ring checked each month from October to March. I will keep the list until someone younger can keep it better." Miriam nodded. Hollis wrote the procedure into record before anyone could forget. 3 days later, delegations from Ridge Arrest and Coldwater arrived by wagon to copy the system. They walked the communal yard with measuring rods, purchased peg bundles from Jonas, and sat in the schoolhouse while Lenora taught ledger columns for cure dates, chord fractions, and reserve thresholds. Earl demonstrated gate alignment with red cloth on poles and had each visitor crawl a test passage carrying a bundle and cup, because design understood in the spine lasted longer than design admired from a doorway. At departure, each delegation received 2 documents: a copy of the barometer readings from October 19th and November 30th, 1887, and a list of the 5 names on the ridge with notation that arithmetic ignored had consequences no freight invoice could reverse. In 1892, Endurance set stone markers at the graves and added a 5th cedar post for Caleb Dunn, where Thaw had first allowed proper cut. The inscription plate, paid by subscription and approved without dissent, carried one line chosen by the council and accepted by Earl after a long quiet. Words do not keep out the wind. Work does. The ring pattern still stands across that country. The rawhide became wire, then better fasteners. The geometry did not change. In Endurance, each autumn begins the same way. Geese low over Willow Creek, bell at dawn, ledgers open, stacks measured, gates tested, Rope lines checked. Earl Lawson's barometer now hangs in the schoolhouse, removed from private keeping so every child can see the cracked brass and the steady needle. Students learn figures, then duty. Provision is taught as a form of mercy when practiced before need. The town remembers that it may be saved by the one it mocked, and that the only honest apology is a structure that holds when the wind returns.